So let me take you back. I want to finish up our discussion of life without parole and begin talking about the birth of the prison, which we'll get to on Thursday, by talking about the world that that is sort of there at the time that the death penalty is becoming disreputable, the period we've been studying in the 18th century, but it's not clear what the alternative is. What are the competitors to the prison in the 18th century at a time when Beccaria, John Howard, and others are spreading so much interest in the idea of reforming the penal system. But before we get to that, let me take you back to life without parole. So let me take you sort of back to where I began that lecture with, by suggesting that life without parole is a new penal modality, one that we've never really had exactly before, at least in the way that it's being used today as a pretty widely spread, not a rare or isolated penalty, and one that in many ways is much harsher than certainly the treatment of anything but executed people in justice systems by and large up till now. Where does that leave us? So is it our new ultimate sanction? It appears to be. The answer to that appears to be yes. For the time being, life without parole is our new ultimate sanction. As an observer of penal trends and generally a critic of them, unfortunately, it doesn't make me comfortable that life without parole is our now ultimate sanction for a couple of reasons. One, as an ultimate sanction, and one that's used much more frequently than the death penalty ever was, life without parole could have a fairly substantial sort of upwardly influencing anchoring of the larger penal scale. What do I mean by that? As we studied at the very beginning of the class, people's sense of retributive outrage at crimes tends to be fairly consistent. When you show them several different crimes, like a robbery, a rape, and a murder, they have no problem kind of ranking them in the severity with which they would like to punish them, the kind of moral outrage they feel at them. But what there's not a lot of agreement is, well, how much is enough? You know, how much is going to be the penalty for murder? Once we set that, maybe we can agree on how much less for rape, how much less for robbery, etc. We know from a lot of studies that this is true not only of punishment, but of how much you're willing to spend for dinner, how much you're willing to spend for college education, and many kinds of choices like that, that certain facts help to establish what your range of expectations or acceptability is. So, for instance, if you go into a restaurant, maybe you've had this experience, and you look at the menu, and under entrees there is, the surf and turf special, $45.95. It's, a really nice cut of steak and a really big piece of lobster. Now, you're not going to order that for sure, and you're hoping that your date won't order it either. And in fact, if you went back into the meat locker, the cold freezer there, what you find is that they actually may not have any of those. They may have a couple of those prepared to go. But by and large, nobody orders those because they're too expensive. But the job of that item on the menu is not to sell you steak and lobster, but to make you prepared to spend $29 for the just steak option, or $35 for the just lobster option, or $27.95 for the chicken option, etc. And that go all the way down to the pasta at $19.95. Right? So prices can have an anchoring effect on us. Right? When you go out looking at college tuitions, if I tell you what I paid to go to Cal in 1977, it's going to make you feel really bad, so I'm not even going to mention. But if I tell you how much they paid at Stanford this year, hoping that you don't pay attention to things like financial aid and other things that might be coming back to them at Stanford, you're going to feel better about what you're paying at Berkeley. Again, the same principle. So the problem with having a really big LWOP penalty, not only on our books, but being practiced, is it sets the new top of the menu price at a very high level, such that if you look at a sentence of a rapist to 60 years in prison, a robber to 40 years in prison, well, that doesn't sound outrageous if a murderer is getting life without parole, right? But if a murderer was getting 20 years, right, which is more or less the norm in most of Europe, it would be unthinkable to give a rapist 60 years, right? Because we would be violating our own cultural sense of the relative proportionality of these crimes. So I think it's very, sort of, from my point of view, as somebody who looks at the larger amount of punishment in society, it makes me nervous that we're going to peg this at a very high level. Now, it's true that the death penalty set it at a very high level, because in fact, if you're executing some people, then almost any amount of time in prison sounds like they're getting a break. But since we use the death penalty so rarely, it may not have quite as much impact as LWOP has. The other thing that makes me worry, and we're going to spend a lot more time thinking about this issue as we finish the remainder of the course, what's it like in prison? What is the situation of trying to manage and administer prisons where you've got a large percentage of people who have no prospect of being released? Right? That is a problem of dignity I want to get to in a moment. That is whether we can simultaneously claim that we are respecting the essential dignity of humanity of prisoners and still put them in that situation where they have no realistic hope for release. But also there's just a kind of management question. How do you manage a prison where lots of people, at least from some point of view, have nothing to lose? And one direction that could go in is toward the kind of supermax isolation lockdown prisons that we have already invested quite heavily in. Actually, footnote, I'll send out an announcement later. The state of California on Friday just announced some new rules for how it's going to try to administer its supermax prisons. And it's something we're going to study in depth in a few weeks, but lots is happening. That just reminded me that I wanted to mention that to you, and I'll send out a link and upload that report up to our course website. But the point is, those relying on lockdown, on very heavy-handed internal discipline, depriving people of contact with other people, communication with the outside, becomes some of the few tools you may have to respond to disciplinary problems when somebody has no chance of paroling. Right? So in contrast, if you know that you're in prison for, say, 20 or 25 years, but after that you can be paroled, based on good behavior and low risk of recidivism, etc., then you have every incentive, not just after 20 years, but during the first 20 years too, to be well behaved in prison, to make the most of your time. And by and large, prisoners do. If you meet some of the lifers that we have here at San Quentin and many other prisoners, many other prisons here in California, they have hope for parole, although it may be an unrealistic hope in many ways, and it really motivates them to work on themselves quite diligently. So that's going to be a problem. Thirdly, some of the things that bother us about the death penalty are going to return, or still be there, I should say, when we look at LWOP. And one of them is, interestingly, the problem of wrongful conviction. We saw that one of the things that shakes Americans' faith, or appears to have shaken the faith of many Americans in the death penalty, is the large number of people who have been shown to be wrongfully convicted, who have been placed on death row, and who have been removed from death row, but of course a reminder that maybe some of these cases don't get caught, and some people may get executed, who are actually innocent of the crimes they've committed. Now, it's true that the death penalty is unique in that regard, because once you're executed, you obviously have no possibility of any kind of recourse if it turns out that you are innocent. And as long as you're alive in prison, in theory, somebody could come forward and admit to the crime, or a cold DNA test could point to somebody either already in prison or dead as guilty of the crime you were committed of. You might get released. Might. The odds are really very, very low. Why? Because if you're sentenced to life without parole, rather than death, you don't get that lawyering that you would get on death row. And if you're sent to death row, you get a lawyer who's going to look at every little fact in your case over and over again and try to find any potential weak links in the prosecution's case, witnesses that may have changed their mind. They're going to re-interview everybody. That's not happening. If you're sent away on LWOP, you're not going to have a right to counsel. If your parents can't afford to mortgage their home and pay for a new lawyer, etc., it's very unlikely that you're going to get that kind of consideration. And yet the prospect of having your entire life exhausted in prison for a crime you didn't commit is in the ballpark of as horrible, I suppose, at least plausibly, as being executed for it. Now, an example of something very much like that, and I'll send out an announcement on this tomorrow, I should say Thursday evening, there'll be a lecture by Raymond Bonner of the New York Times, who's just written a book about a South Carolina inmate who was sentenced to death for a terrible murder of the sort that you and Durkheim would both imagine would lead to a death penalty or a lynching, the rape murder of an elderly woman, I believe it was. And in this case, a man, an African American, was sentenced to death. Eventually, his death sentence was overturned, but he has been serving essentially a life sentence until very recently. Further evidence of his innocence persuaded the court and the prosecutors to agree essentially to a plea bargain in which he is going to plead guilty or has pled guilty to essentially the crime, and he's going to be released on time served. So there won't be an official vindication in that sense. But Bonner, who's written a whole book on this case, very much believes that this man was absolutely innocent, not just somebody who was there and maybe wasn't doing bad stuff compared to his crime partners. No, somebody who was just not on the scene, not there, wrong person in Chicago, somewhere else. Anyway, some of you will be interested in this lecture. The point being, we just don't know how many people like that there are in American prisons today who don't have a death penalty and therefore don't have the kind of lawyering it takes to get out. So there's a lot of reasons, in my view, for being concerned about LWOP remaining our ultimate sanction. And the biggest one to me, and I'm going to sort of talk about this in the last section here, is whether it's compatible with this notion of dignity that we saw is becoming revitalized as a principle in American constitutional law of punishment. We saw that in the Brown versus Cloud case, and we'll be studying it in greater detail. As I mentioned last time, 2 years ago, in the Graham versus Florida case, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down LWOP sentences of juveniles who had not committed murder. And they did so under the Eighth Amendment on proportionality grounds, but using language that very much resonated with the idea of the essential dignity of the prisoner as a limiting feature to punishment when the court talked about the right to hope, the right to have hope that you might ultimately be able to be released. And so there's a real question as to whether dignity is compatible with, or I should say whether LWOP is compatible with dignity. Now the case in front of the Supreme Court this term, it's a combination of 2 cases, Miller versus Alabama and Jackson versus Hobbs cases, will give the court a chance to look at that question, but may not give us any real indicator of what they would do with the adult case if and when it eventually comes up, for reasons I'll suggest. So there's the quote from Graham versus Sullivan suggesting that hope of restoration and a realistic hope, something beyond just the empty promise of gubernatorial consideration for pardon or clemency, is critical. I think I showed you these facts before. These are serious, severe cases, sort of unlike to some extent, although they're, the case profiled in the New Yorker also involved a murder, and there's something inherently serious about a murder. These cases are even perhaps more aggravated because they involve the killing of non-family members in the context of other crimes. In Jackson versus Hobbs, it's in the context of a robbery type of murder, which is often one of the most severely punished contexts for crime. Now, throughout the course, we've been looking at how the court thinks about cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. And it's not a law class. I want you to feel comfortable with the kind of considerations that the court gives when it thinks about whether a particular penalty is cruel and unusual or not. But I'm not going to hold you responsible for the finer points of the doctrine. But here's an opportunity for me to just kind of tell you a little bit more about how the court's analysis works. Interestingly, the court has thought about cruel and unusual punishment and the question of whether a punishment for a particular crime is disproportionate a bit differently when it's a capital crime and when it's a non-capital crime. When it's the death penalty we're talking about, the court has basically asked 2 questions in the following order. First, what are the different states in the United States doing with crimes like this? Whether it's executing juveniles or the retarded, using the death penalty for child rape in the Kennedy versus Louisiana case. Let's look at trends in the states to see, in a sense, objective indicators of evolving standards of decency. How do the American public, in this almost Durkheimian sense, feel about different kinds of punishment, and what can we tell from trends in the states? If there's an indication from these trends that perhaps the penalty that's being challenged is in fact unusual and perhaps disproportionate, given the fact that a lot of states don't follow that, the court comes to a second question, which is more of a subjective analysis. When we look at this, when we, the court, look at this crime and this punishment, is it proportionate? And as we know from the 3 strikes case, the kind of questions asked there, as well as death penalty cases, is given the classic purposes of punishment, retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, can this penalty be squared with this crime? Right? Now, in non-capital cases, they take the same questions but in the reverse order. They first ask, what's the kind of relationship between the crime and the punishment just in the abstract, from our point of view, a kind of subjective test. And only if they decide that it's disproportionate in that regard do they go ahead and ask, well, what's happening in the states? How unusual is a penalty like this? Now, does that matter which order you do these in? Maybe not. But it's interesting that in Graham versus Florida, the juvenile LWOP non-homicide case from two years ago, apparently a non-capital case, right? They're not sentenced to death. Yet the Supreme Court did it in the capital order. That is, they first looked at what was going on in the states, and then they kind of did their weighing analysis of the crime and the penalty. Now, again, thinking about the kind of cognitive biases we've just been talking about with prices, I think you can see how that might, the first step, if you go through it, of looking at what's going on in the states, might influence your judgment, right? So if you see that this is really pretty rare, pretty exceptional, and that the trends are not in favor of it, it's pretty hard to put up an iron curtain between that and your analysis of, does this seem like an appropriate, rationalizable, justifiable punishment for this crime, right? Having been told that this is now pretty unusual, becoming rarer, that could very much influence your analysis. And some people think that's just what happened in Graham versus Florida. So assuming they do the same kind of analysis in the new cases that are in front of them, the first thing they're going to notice is that, at least if we look at people who commit their crimes when they're 14, right, these are people under 15, a minority of states, 19, would even allow such a sentence to be handed down. And when we look at how many such sentences have actually been handed down, not just whether they could be, it's minuscule. Out of some 3,632 murders since 1990 that have been done by murders that were under 15, that's a pretty chilling fact. Right? I didn't even know that there were that many murders committed by people 14 or under. Only 58 received this LWOP sentence. So again, if you're thinking of that metaphor of lightning striking, sharp bites, deaths from spider bites, other kinds of incredibly rare and arbitrary events, this would look like one of them. So if the court looks at that, they may, in a sense, say, this looks like it could be disproportionate. What do we make of it when we look at it in the abstract? Here's a crime, here's a punishment. Is it not just disproportionate, but in order to find it unconstitutional, we have to find it grossly disproportionate. Is it grossly disproportionate? Well, they said it was in Graham, but keep in mind that was for non-homicide crimes. The offenders in Graham, at very young ages, they committed heinous crimes like rapes and robberies and kidnappings, but they hadn't killed. And arguably, life has a kind of relationship to homicide. You take a life, you give up your life, or at least experience it in prison in a kind of perpetuity of punishment. That might seem more justifiable. It does certainly to a lot of people. will it to the court? Well, the big issue probably in this case is going to be, again, the juvenile status. We saw in Graham versus, we saw in Roper versus Simmons, the juvenile death penalty case, that when it comes to the two most important justifications for capital punishment, that is retribution and deterrence, the court felt that the very nature of juveniles makes them less susceptible or appropriately punished under these justifications. Why? Because if the idea is to deter you, and if we believe that because of your cognitive lack of full development, you are not really capable of considering what the future consequences of your behavior may be, then it's kind of futile to say that we're deterring you. We may be deterring other people, but we're not deterring people who are under 15 from committing these crimes. It's like whatever inclination they have to commit that crime, it's not going to be altered probably by knowing that they might get life without parole. To the extent that they're not influenced by the thought that they might have to spend the night in jail, and a lot of studies show that they're not, the fact that they might have to spend every other night for the rest of their lives in jail doesn't seem to add much to the equation. On the retribution side, if the idea is that people who commit the most harmful acts in a way that is they're really responsible for, that they're culpable of, that it's not a mistake or something that can be explained by things that happen to them or that they're experiencing like illness, etc., then they justly deserve the punishment. Arguably, the same cognitive defects make juveniles less worthy of punishment, less culpable in that sense. Now, if we look at those two justifications, it may well be, it would be difficult to see, in fact, how the Supreme Court could distinguish Roper versus Simmons from this setting. They could say that life without parole is not as punitive as the death penalty, but to the extent that retribution and deterrence justify it, it doesn't seem to have any more purchase on those two than it did in the death penalty case. But if we think about the situation of adults, it's very different, right? It is plausible, even if not particularly convincing to me, but it's plausible that the threat of a life without parole sentence, as compared to a life sentence or just a long sentence, might have a deterrent effect on an adult. And it's certainly plausible that, at least for some very aggravated crimes, it reflects a degree of intentional harm doing, right? What do you make of somebody who's prepared to blow up an airplane full of people, say, to make a political point, even at the cost of their own life? So on the juvenile front, I'd say on those two grounds, quite likely the Supreme Court might lean toward overturning juvenile LWOP. When we put the adults in the picture, not very likely. Then there's incapacitation. And here, I think this is where it will get very interesting to see what the court does. The Supreme Court has said that incapacitation is not a consideration in justifying the death penalty. Why? Because life in prison without parole would do just as well. So you can't really justify the need for the death penalty on incapacitated grounds, because LWOP, there's no way really to show, unless you think somebody's going to escape from prison and commit crimes, or kill somebody in prison, and that is always a chance. But if you combine LWOP with supermax imprisonment, where somebody's in a completely technically controlled cage, 23 hours a day, except to go to a shower or a dog run, you could probably reduce that risk of future harm to near zero. So it's hard to justify the death penalty on incapacitation grounds. But what about life without parole? And here I have some concerns about both juveniles and adults. Many judges and prosecutors believe, not necessarily on good criminological grounds, but on kind of gut instinct, that if you're committing a heinous crime at 15, then you must be the kind of person that would be a threat for the rest of your life. Right? And you heard that in Roper when the prosecutor, they quoted the prosecutor's summary to the jury, and he kind of said, I don't consider his youthfulness to be mitigating. Think how scary this guy's going to be in 20 years, given what he did now at 16 or 17. So for a lot of prosecutors and judges, and maybe Supreme Court justices, incapacitation will be a reasonable justification for LWOP. And notice and the same would be true, obviously, for adults. Now, with the adults, you might have the caveat, maybe they're not as much of a threat if you think that having an early juvenile criminal career is predictive of future propensity. So where do I leave this off? I think it's very likely that the Supreme Court, I think it's quite possible, it's quite possible that the Supreme Court will strike down juvenile LWOP. But I'm not at all confident of it. I think they could go either way. It'll be 5-4 either way, and I'm not sure how it'll come out. When it comes to adult LWOP, under current doctrinal formulations, I see almost no chance of the Supreme Court striking it down. So where does that leave us? Well, one question is this question of dignity. If the Supreme Court continues to elevate the notion of dignity and the idea that punishments must respect the essential human dignity of the imprisoned or the punished, then one question we can ask is, does LWOP violate this right to dignity? Now, the European Court of Human Rights has kind of looked at that question, and as we saw last time, they've kind of punted by kicking the ball literally downfield and saying it's too early to tell. These people who are bringing these cases haven't been in prison long enough. Let's see what happens in 20 years after they've really served a lot of time and they're not a risk to anybody. If the state still wants to hold them, maybe that will be a form of cruel and degrading punishment because there will be no penal rationale for holding them. The U.S. Supreme Court hasn't shown any inclination to sort of adopt that kind of notion that that we should look first at a sentence in the abstract and then come back years later and ask whether it still makes sense. So I don't have a lot of confidence that they're going to do that in the short term. In the long term, the real question will be, is life without parole, if it's real, if there really is not going to be reconsideration after 25 years or real executive clemency that actually happens, does that violate the right to essential human dignity? Well, that's a question I don't have an easy answer to yet. My own inclination has been to think that it's not compatible with dignity, that you can't tell somebody there's no chance that we can ever release you and at the same time convincingly say that we still respect you as a human being. But I'm not certain about that. I'm genuinely not certain about it. It seems to me, certainly if somebody posed a risk to other people, we could say that to them, right? So that gets me easily to the point of saying, if we have a parole system where we can consider releasing people, but we choose not to release somebody because we think they're still a risk, does that violate their right to essential human dignity? That I'm pretty comfortable saying no to. If we're really giving a serious consideration to the risk they pose, then I think we can turn, one test of dignity is basically, can you say to somebody, I respect your human dignity, and at the next moment say to them, but I'm going to continue doing my job to keep you locked up for the rest of your life. I don't think you can say to somebody, I respect your essential human dignity, but my job is to kill you in the next 24 hours, so I'm going to do that. I hope you don't take that personally. I don't think you can really say that. It doesn't really work. But I think it's possible that you could say that to somebody about LWOP. You could say, I respect your essential human dignity, but I need to keep you in prison for the rest of your life, if the person poses a real risk.